Jean-Clément Martin. Welcome to Grey History.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be there and to answer your question.
Oh, I'm glad to have you here as well. I mean, this is one of the most interesting but divisive aspects of the entire revolutionary era, and so I'm really thrilled to get into the details with you on this. When one first studies the Vendée, it's common to find historians that are focused on various local factors which led to the revolt. The importance of religion, conscription, the tensions between towns and the countryside, etc. However, your research goes further than these localized factors and places great emphasis on the situation in Paris. In particular, you note how the politics of the capital shapes everything from the Republic's military response to how it conceptualizes the Vendée and how it thinks about this internal enemy. How important are the political struggles of Paris to understanding the civil war in the West?
Now, for me, the political struggles in Paris are the most important things because it is necessary to go to the fact. The Vendée War, la guerre de Vendée, began when the deputies of the convention in Paris learned that a very small army has been defeated by the insurgent in the Vendée department, le département de la Vendée. It's one of the 18 three departments dividing the France. These rebels refused only to fight on the border and rejected also the religious and political reforms of the revolution. There was not a very specificity of the rebels in this department because all these rebels, which were there victorious on March 1793, took part in a major revolt that affected at the same time the whole of Western France and roughly a quarter of the nation. So what happened in Vendée was very common, in fact, and the battle on March 1793 did not merit the light put on it. Okay. But what happened, in fact, that in Paris, in the convention, the Montagnards, Jacobins, the Montagnard deputies, learning about that defeat in the department of Vendée, accuse their Girondin rival to be the traitors and to be the allié of complicity with the rebels. And so what happened, it is necessary for the convention to send in the department of Vendée a great army coming from all the region in France to crush this alliance between counter-revolutionary, like Catholic, like in Brittany and so on, and Girondin to be crushed in this alliance, this political alliance. And that is the way that created the department Vendée like public enemy number one. So the fact that created the War of Vendée and created the monstrous alliance between the revolutionary Girondins and the counter-revolutionaries Vendéens. It is a false alliance and it did not correspond to the reality. The reality was that in March 1793, it was only poorly organized peasants who would have been crushed in a matter of weeks by violent and well-executed repression as happened in Brittany. This was not imposed on the department of Vendée. Exactly on the contrary, this confusion between insurgent and politicians, administrators, generals, and so on led to the great chaos. And the great chaos was immediately turned on the benefice for those insurgents south of Loire. We were so able to set up Catholic and warrior armies, and those armies could hold the region through the spring and the summer of 1793. If I can resemble in one sentence, it was not the real good point of view to see that sort of explosion of rebellion in the department of Vendée, but confusing counter-revolution and political struggle in Paris create that mythic Vendée and engage all the nation in this war, which became very rapidly absolutely violent and devastating. Okay?
So we have these outbreaks of rebellions in March 1793, and as you say, they're not particularly noteworthy. There are large parts of the country that are
Absolutely.
experiencing unrest, especially as it relates to recruitment riots. But the problem is that it gets weaponized in the National Convention by these factional struggles. And it becomes, as you say, a bit of a myth, a
Yeah,
monster, this
absolutely.
epitome of counter-revolution. And then, in addition to that, you have an inadequate response from the Girondins in the convention, and the Montagnards and the Sans-Culotte movement outside are able to continue to weaponize this. And especially after further defeats and then the purge of the Girondins on the 2nd of June, you were able to really draw, as you say, this false alliance or this false connection. But at the time, it was very much perceived by some to be real, of this, as you say, false alliance between the Girondins and the rebels in the West that are far greater than this one department of Vendée. At the end of your answer, you referenced the level of violence that we see here in Western France. You know, the severity of the violence is significantly more than what we see in other parts of the country, even in the Federalist revolts. What is happening in the Vendée is significantly greater. For you, what are the factors that are driving the severity of this violence?
I think there are two reasons for explaining this extreme violence at work in the south of Loire. The first reason is the radical nature of the political struggles that have taken place since 1789. Political enemies are seen at that time as traitors who must be destroyed. This state of mind explains the massacre of September 1792 in Paris, but also in several other cities in all France. And this state of mind explains also the death of the king and the death also of the queen in 1793. The other reason was the disorganization of the armies sent south of Loire. There were a lot of bad soldiers, very bad soldiers, and those soldiers were poorly led by officers incapable of directing troops, and they all clash in political plots against each other. And those clash were very important to the point of letting Catholic troops win battles so that the rival could be dismissed or even killed by Republican armies. So it's very impossible to understand how much it was a chaos between the spring of 1793 to the spring 1794. It is necessary also to insist on the fact that there were major battles which take place in South Loire during all the summer and autumn 1793. Tens of thousands of fighters clash during all this year until the main Catholic army was obliged to travel across Brittany in autumn. This virée de galère, this long march against Brittany, was accompanied by great battles and atrocities during October, November, December 1793. And then, in the beginning of 1794, destruction plans were launched to exterminate what they called the brigands de la Vendée, so that troops are committing great massacres, but also arson and rapes in part of the region in the South Loire. And all the result of those clash and massacre was appalling and pointless, and so that the Republican troops were obliged to abandon the plan until they were even signing peace treaties with the insurgent in 1795. So it was big battles, massacres, and execution in thousands of cases, and the war was a disaster for the republics and was recognized as a disaster in the summer 1794. It is necessary to understand the complexity of this war, and it is necessary also to speak about the toll, human toll. It is terrible. It is certainly more than 200,000 people who were dead or missing in the war. However, and I think necessary to conclude this point by a comparison, it seems to me necessary to underline that at the same time, colonial wars in Haiti were even more monstrous, and that disasters with all those savageries, all those monstrosity, were particularly in Italy and Spain taken place during the war led by Napoleon. And it is not an excuse for what happened in Vendée during the French Revolution, but it seems to me necessary to make a right comparison, to be not so implicated politically to judge what happened, but to historically understand what happened really.
You talk about the comparable atrocities that occur in other regions at this time and in similar eras. And you also make reference to the fact of some of the factors that are driving this, including the disorder. In fact, we heard from a contemporary in the main episodes that described it like anarchy, the rivalries between the various generals and political appointees and emissaries and the like. But you also mentioned there the savagery that occurs here in Western France. And for some scholars, these most controversial elements of the Civil War, including the mass drownings of late 1793 and the infernal columns of 1794 that you were just discussing, for some historians, these are horrific examples of the terror. However, you are famous for your opposition to the term the terror. You've described it as an invention and a myth. Are you able to elaborate briefly, if even if we kind of step back from the Vendée and talk just briefly about the Terror, why you oppose labeling this period of the revolution as the Terror, and what terms you would rather use instead?
Yes, you're right. I am really opposed to the use of the word of terror to qualify this period for three reasons. The first one, it is necessary to remember that the word of terror is the monstrous form of governing a nation. For all those people living in at that time, terror is the politics of the despotism, and the French Revolution could not be a terrorist regime. And it is very important to understand that fact. And until the spring of 1793, all the deputies in the convention didn't want, absolutely not want, the possibility to be terrorist. It was impossible for them. It will be also necessary to say that the word terrorist did not exist at that time. And it is the second reason for me to take my distance with the word of terror, that it is only in the spring of 1793 that the sans-culotte demands that terror, like a regime conducted by despot, the terror could be used against all the counter-revolutionaries. Counter-revolutionaries, it is a very vague word. Girondins, but also Montagnards were called also counter-revolutionaries later. And until September and October 1793, the convention did not accept that terror could be put on agenda. But if the convention refused that terror could be a regime, a political regime, the convention allowed that the sans-culotte could be leader of local armies, army révolutionnaires, which are not the real armies of the nation. The convention allowed also that the sans-culotte could be in charge of the Vendéan War. And after September, October 1793, all the armies engaged against the Vendéens were directed by officers linked to the sans-culotte. My conviction is that the convention waited for the destruction of the Vendéan army, but also for the sans-culotte armies. And that it was in fact what happened. In December 1793, the sans-culotte lost all their power and allowed that the convention in Paris could judge the leaders sans-culotte as counter-revolutionaries and send them to the guillotine. And Robespierre was one who sent his lost friends to the guillotine in March 1794. So it seems to me that in the convention played a sort of treason against the sans-culottes themselves, because during all that time, 1793, 1794, the convention voted 3 times against the possibility to impose the terror in France. And at the last time, on the 8th Thermidor, 26th July 1794, the last time that Robespierre took the tribune, take the floor in the convention, he refused 2 times to use of the terror and the political terror. But even he was outvoted and he was executed, everybody knows, on 10th of Thermidor. And immediately, or 1 month after, his opponents accused him of having established and directed terror in France. And it is important to understand that until July 1794, it was impossible for the convention to accept that the regime of terror could be put in place. And 1 month after the death of Robespierre, the same deputies, but now against Robespierre, accused Robespierre to have imposed the reign of the terror in France, forgetting what Robespierre said, forgetting their own votes before. It's a completely upset politics. And it is necessary to understand that those facts was accepted in France because all the partisans of the denunciation of Robespierre could be able to wash themselves of any implication. They accept to work with Robespierre And then, after August 1794, they said, no, we are absolutely free. Robespierre was a monster. He was directed our action. We were absolutely non-culpable. And the worst for me that they are inventing the word terrorist. Terrorists had no existence before September, October 1794. Today, we are always using the word terrorist to qualify all sorts of things. But terrorist was the invention after the death of Robespierre to clarify what happened, that invention of the terror. For myself, I think it is necessary to forget terror to speak of état d'exception. The état d'exception, I believe that it's possible to understand even in English when nobody can speak French. L'état d'exception was decided after 17 October 1793, okay? And it was called gouvernement révolutionnaire, revolutionary government, on December 1793. And it lasts until the spring and then the beginning of the summer of 1795, far after the death of Robespierre. And so, calling the terror, speaking of the terror, with the end on Thermidor on July 1794, it's a real historical fault and big error.
Well, a lot to unpack there. And listeners, obviously, we are still in 1793 and we will be heading into 1794 in due course. And we will see those tensions that were just discussed around the sans-culottes and the revolutionary armies of the sans-culottes with the convention, including with the Montagnards and Robespierre and Danton and the like. And then we're also going to see these debates and further unpack these debates about the terror and how we think of the era and how we think of Robespierre's place in it, as well as the actions that occur after his downfall in the second half of 1794. But I'd like to turn and kind of wrap up this interview with one of the other great debates, and this focuses on the Vendée. And I want to discuss perhaps the most controversial debate of the revolutionary era, perhaps even more controversial than the discussions around the terror. You have spent much of your career refuting the idea that a genocide occurred in Western France. For you, why is it incorrect to describe these events as a genocide? And why is it important to maintain the distinction between genocide and other crimes against humanity like those that you referenced earlier?
Yeah, this is a very important question, and especially actually in the day we're living. Okay, so first of all, it's necessary to say for me that the question of the genocide in the Vendée is a very legitimate question. It was necessary to ask this question and to discuss. However, and for me it's difficult because I'm debating this question for more than 40 years. It's horrible. And I discuss also this question because for me this question is only polemical reason. Speaking of genocide in Vendée, as the possibility to accuse the secular Republican and to crush all the memory of the left Republican France. It's not a question of justice. For myself, a very political, polemical question. Okay, first of all. Second, I must underline the fact that if I said at many times that there was no genocide in Vendée, I was the historian which we calculated the greatest toll in the Vendée. For me, more than 200,000 people were killed or disappeared during the war. The man we spoke the first time of genocide, the toll was exactly half of my estimation. In fact, a paradoxal position to refuse genocide and to give the toll, the greatest toll of destruction. But it is a fact. Alors, why it is not possible for me to speak of genocide? It lacks two things. The first is that at any time, the Republican regime did not decide and did not define a distinct groups of opponent. When the convention spoke the first time in March 1793 of the Vendée, it was not against groups specific. The insurgent in the Vendée was only Catholic, fighting for religious and political reasons, like Brittany, like Alsatian, like Basque, and so on. And when the convention spoke about Vendée, it was also referred to the department of the Vendée. And even in December 1793, when the department was recalified from Vendée, it became Vengée. It was vengeance against the department. We changed the word. There was not the possibility for any deputies in the convention to imagine that Vendée was the description of a great region. The border of the region was never defined, and it was no definition of the brigand of the Vendée. Never, never. And at the same times, all the convention decided to give financial support to the Vendée refugees because there were more than 40,000 people leaving the Vendée, qualified of refugees of the Vendée, and we will live with money given by the convention. So it was not a specific groups, and well, it was not, the will to destroy a specific group was never defined, was never given. And it was not also a specific intention to destroy the groups as a group. And it is possible to look at the action of the colonnes infernales, the specific, with the monstrous army sent against the Vendée just at the beginning of 1794, which were without real order and which could kill people, either counter-revolutionary or also true Republican. And it is necessary to understand that it is impossible to have the specific acts of genocide possibility to destroy a group. But on the contrary, I think also necessary to insist on what little fact largely unknown, because on the same time, at the beginning of 1794, the Basque, the population in the Pays Basque, south of France, where the population who don't speak French, were 2, 3, 4,000, exactly, it is impossible to know, were deported from their villages to Bordeaux, eventually to the Cantal in the south of France, and were deported because they don't speak French and because they were considered as traitors helping the Spaniard troops against France. And if people want to find a genocide, I think it will be possible to find genocide in Pays Basque, but not in the Vendée, because it was not possible to identify a group, identify the political intents.
I'm so glad that you brought up the experience of the Basque people on the French side of the border there, because as you say, it is often overlooked in these discussions. And debatably has a much better claim to the term genocide, given the treatment of a distinct people and the treatment of the entirety of that group relating to mass deportations and worse. To summarize for listeners, what Jean-Clément Martin was saying there is that because the convention never identifies a distinct group, it never defines a distinct group, and it then never treats that distinct group with kind of equal contempt. As Jean-Clément Martin was just saying there, refugees are coming out of this region and the convention is actively helping to resettle them. The convention is giving them funds. They are not trying to eradicate this distinct group. And again, this group has never been clearly defined by the convention. And while you do have atrocities and the most horrific of crimes, this is occurring in a situation where many of the forces on the ground are out of control, chaotic. There is significant tensions and anarchy between the Republican troops. And as was just said there, not only are counter-revolutionaries being killed, and indeed non-combatants being killed, but also genuine supporters of the revolution are being caught up in this. And again, the revolutionaries, when they believe that they have found Vendéans that are pro-regime and pro-republican, they are given considerable support. And that is not what you would see in a traditional genocide, where all members of a distinct ethnic group or nationality or religious group would be persecuted by a regime irrelevant of their political beliefs. Would that be a fair summary?
Absolutely. Bravo. Thank you very much. It's very clear.
No, thank you. And Jean-Clément Martin, thank you so much for your time. I know that we've covered a lot of ground today in this interview. I will put into the show notes some of your academic articles that have been translated into English. And for those members of and listeners of the show that do speak French, I will link to some of your French books as well. And Jean-Clément Martin, thank you again so much for your time coming on Great History.
Thank you.